Subscribe to the channel right now and like this video if you're drawn to stories of justice, power, and quiet revenge. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell. The end of a lie doesn't always sound like shouting. Sometimes it sounds like a zipper sliding up a wool coat. That was the sound that ended Claire Harrington's marriage. It was 10:04 p.m. on Christmas Eve in Darien, Connecticut. Snow cut sideways across the street, blurring the warm glow of perfect homes behind white curtains. Inside one of them, Grant Harrington stood by the door, polished, calm, convincing, explaining why he had to fly to London right now. Compliance crisis. Asian markets. No choice. Claire didn't argue. She didn't cry. She helped him find his passport. Upstairs, their children slept. By the fireplace, the family dog barely lifted his head. When the door closed, Claire didn't follow. She walked to her office, opened her laptop, and made one call, because Grant thought he was leaving for London. But Claire had been counting the days until he left at all. Darien, Connecticut, on Christmas Eve, had perfected the art of pretending nothing bad could ever happen there. Snow swept sideways across the quiet streets, clinging to the bare branches of old maple trees like silver ash. Every house glowed warm windows, wreaths trimmed with white lights, driveways cleared just enough to suggest order. It was the kind of neighborhood real estate brochures loved, the kind where betrayal never looked like it belonged. Inside the Harrington house, the silence had weight. Grant Harrington stood near the front door, pulling on his black wool coat. The zipper slid up with a sharp, final sound, clean, efficient, irreversible. The sound landed somewhere deep in Claire Harrington's chest, though her face didn't change. Grant was 51, tall and carefully proportioned, the kind of man whose face looked composed even when relaxed. His jaw was angular, clean-shaven tonight, though by morning it would show the faint shadow of stubble that made him look perpetually busy. His hair, dark with threads of gray at the temples, was combed back with the precision of habit. He smelled faintly of cedarwood cologne and airport lounges. Grant moved the way men who live in boardrooms do, every gesture controlled, every pause deliberate. "I really hate to do this," he said, checking his watch. His voice was calm, smooth, practiced. It was the same voice he used on clients when markets dipped and millions evaporated overnight. But compliance flagged a serious issue tied to the Asian Open. If I don't get ahead of it, it could snowball. London, he had said earlier. London, because it sounded heavy enough to end arguments and distant enough to discourage follow-up questions. Claire stood a few steps away, barefoot on the heated stone floor, one hand resting lightly on the marble kitchen island she had designed herself. At 48, she carried herself with a quiet discipline that made people straighten their backs without realizing why. She was tall, lean, without being fragile. Her posture shaped by years of construction sites and client meetings where hesitation was weakness. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a low, precise knot at the base of her neck. No loose strands, no softness she hadn't chosen. Her face was composed, almost serene. High cheekbones, clear pale skin that rarely flushed, eyes a steady gray-green that missed very little. Claire Harrington was a nationally respected architect, known for designing homes that looked effortless while hiding astonishing complexity beneath the surface. Glass that carried weight, lines that lied. She nodded once. "Did you check your passport?" Grant blinked, surprised. "I know. It should be in the drawer." "I'll get it." She walked past him toward the study, her steps quiet. She returned with the dark blue passport, holding it out to him without comment. "Thanks," he said, offering a brief smile. It didn't reach his eyes. Upstairs, the house slept. Sophie, 11, had fallen asleep clutching a paperback novel, her bedside lamp still glowing. Noah, 8, lay sprawled across his bed like a fallen star, one sock missing, his Christmas list crushed under his pillow. Neither knew their father was leaving. Neither knew anything was wrong. By the fireplace, Baxter lifted his head. Baxter was a 7-year-old golden retriever, broad-chested and heavy-boned, his coat a warm amber that glowed in the firelight. His muzzle had begun to gray, giving him the perpetually concerned expression of a creature who sensed shifts long before humans did. He watched Grant with dark, steady eyes and let out a low, uncertain huff. "Easy, boy," Grant said, not looking at him. Claire did. Baxter's tail thumped once against the rug, then stilled. "The car's here," Grant said, glancing toward the driveway where headlights cut pale arcs through the snow. "I'll be back in 2 days. We'll do Christmas properly when I return." "Of course," Claire said. Grant hesitated, then leaned in and kissed her cheek. The contact was brief, dry, more habit than affection. A transaction completed. "Tell the kids I love them," he said, already reaching for his carry-on. "I will." The front door opened. Cold air rushed in, sharp and biting. Snow swirled in like something alive. Grant stepped out, turned once as if to say something else, then thought better of it. The door closed behind him with a solid, echoing click. The house exhaled. Claire didn't move for a full minute. She stood where she was, listening as the sound of the engine faded, as tires crunched down the long driveway, as the illusion of Zurich or London, or wherever he thought his lie needed to land, disappeared into the storm. She crossed to the window and drew back the curtain. The taillights vanished at the bend in the road, swallowed by white. Claire felt nothing like heartbreak. Heartbreak was loud, messy. This was something else, cold, clarifying, almost surgical. She turned away and walked into her home office. Grant had always called it her little studio, as if it were a hobby room rather than the command center of a firm that employed dozens and billed millions. The desk was clean. The shelves held architectural journals and binders labeled in Claire's precise handwriting. She closed the door behind her, sat, and opened her laptop. The screen lit her face in pale blue. Claire Harrington did not discover her husband's lie tonight. She had known for weeks. She knew because numbers told stories long before people did. 6 weeks earlier, she had been reviewing the Harrington family trust money left by her parents, money intended for Sophie and Noah, money Grant had insisted on managing personally to save on firm fees. The transfer had been subtle, just one line buried among others, $82,400. Cedar Ridge Strategies, LLC. She had asked him about it over dinner. He hadn't even looked up from his tablet. "Angel investment," he'd said lightly. "Green infrastructure. It's aligned with your work. 400% upside." It was a perfect answer. Too perfect. Claire had checked anyway. That night, alone in this same room, she had pulled the registration records. Delaware filing, virtual Manhattan address, registered agent, Tessa Wynne. The name had meant nothing then. It meant everything now. Claire reached for her phone. She didn't call her sister. She didn't call a friend. She didn't cry into anyone's voicemail. She called the only person who could turn knowledge into consequence. The phone rang once. "Marianne Holt," a woman answered. The voice was crisp, alert, stripped of warmth, a voice that slept lightly and woke ready. "Marianne," Claire said. "It's Claire Harrington." A pause. Then, "Is he gone?" "Yes." Another pause, shorter this time. "Where did he say he was going?" "London." A quiet exhale, almost a smile in sound. "And where is he really?" "Colorado." "Vail." "Good," Marianne said. "That gives us room." Marianne Holt was in her early 60s, though no one ever guessed correctly. She was tall, narrow-shouldered, with steel-gray hair cut blunt at her jaw and eyes that had watched men unravel for decades. She dressed in tailored suits and spoke like a closing argument even when ordering coffee. People didn't hire Marianne Holt to save marriages. They hired her to end them cleanly. "I have everything ready," Marianne continued. "The filings are drafted. The financial forensics team is on standby. Once he's out of state, jurisdiction works in our favor." Claire looked at the dark window, at her own reflection layered over falling snow. "He thinks I believe him." "They always do." "Then we proceed." "Yes," Marianne said, "we proceed." Claire closed her eyes for just a second. When she opened them, her voice was steady. "He's left the house," she said. "We can begin." 6 months earlier, before snow erased the streets of Darien and before Grant Harrington learned how silence could be weaponized, Claire Harrington sat alone in her office with a mug of coffee gone cold and a spreadsheet that would not behave. The Harrington Family Trust had always been tidy. Claire's father had been an engineer, methodical, stubborn, allergic to loose ends, and the trust reflected that temperament. Line items aligned, transfers were predictable. Balances rose and fell with the calm logic of markets, never with drama. Claire reviewed it quarterly out of habit, not fear. She believed in foundations. She believed that if you checked the load-bearing walls often enough, nothing catastrophic could surprise you. Until one number did. $82,400. It sat there in neutral font. No bold, no red flag, no exclamation point. Just a transfer out, dated 3 days earlier, routed to a company she didn't recognize. Cedar Ridge Strategies, LLC, L. Claire leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling, not alarmed yet, just attentive. She was 48 and had spent her adult life translating problems into solutions. Panic was inefficient. Questions came first. That evening she asked Grant about it the way she asked about most things, casually, without accusation. They were finishing dinner, the children upstairs arguing over bath time, Baxter asleep at Grant's feet. "Oh, that," Grant said, barely glancing up from his tablet. "Angel investment." He smiled then, the reassuring Wall Street smile that had closed deals and quieted rooms for decades. "Sustainable building materials, early stage. It's actually very aligned with your work, Claire. I thought you'd like that." She raised an eyebrow. "You invested trust money without mentioning it?" "I manage it," he said smoothly. "That's the whole point. And it's a small allocation. High upside, 400% potential within 18 months. It was a flawless answer. Specific without being technical, complimentary without being patronizing, and delivered with the same calm certainty he used when markets trembled. "Who's behind it?" she asked. "Former McKinsey guys," he said instantly. "Stanford MBA types. Smart money's already in." Claire nodded. "Send me the deck when you have time." "Of course." He never did. That night, after the house settled into its familiar quiet, Claire returned to her office and opened her laptop. She didn't start with emotion. She started with public records. Cedar Ridge Strategies, LLC, was registered in Delaware 3 months earlier. That wasn't unusual. Delaware was where corporations went to be born quietly. But the registered address, a Midtown Manhattan office suite, raised a mild itch at the base of her skull. Virtual office, mail forwarding, a place where companies existed without existing. The registered agent's name stopped her hand on the mouse. Tessa Wynn. The name was common enough to mean nothing on its own. But Claire had learned early in her career that names repeated themselves for reasons. She opened a new tab and searched. Tessa Wynn was 29. She worked as a brand strategy director at a rival firm Grant had mentioned in passing once or twice. Her LinkedIn profile was polished, minimalist, confident. Dark hair cut into a sharp bob, pale skin with the practiced glow of someone who knew her angles. Her smile in photos was ambitious rather than warm, the kind that suggested intention rather than invitation. Claire closed the tab and sat still. She did not confront Grant. She did not accuse him. She did not ask follow-up questions that could warn him he'd miscalculated. Instead, she did what she always did when something felt structurally unsound. She hired help. The private investigator Marianne Holt recommended was named Daniel Price, a man in his mid-40s with a weathered face and a permanent squint, as if he'd spent too much of his life staring into the sun. He dressed plainly, spoke softly, and had the careful politeness of someone who knew how easily trust could be broken. "Discretion is the job," he told Claire during their brief meeting in a quiet Stamford cafe. "Truth is the result." "What can you find?" Claire asked. "Anything that exists," he said. "Give me time." 2 weeks later, Daniel Price emailed her a report. It was thorough, methodical, brutal in its simplicity. There were more LLCs. Not many, just enough to test boundaries. Cedar Ridge had been the first. Then came Summit Vale Holdings. Then Northline Advisory, each registered within weeks of the last, each connected by routing patterns that suggested intent, not coincidence. And then there was the photograph. It showed a man on a yacht, one arm wrapped around a woman whose face was turned toward him, laughing. The angle hid most of his features, but the watch was unmistakable. A Breitling with a dark blue face. Claire had given it to Grant on their 10th anniversary, the inscription still engraved on the back. The timestamp placed the photo in the British Virgin Islands. The same weekend, Grant had told her he was in Chicago at a leadership retreat. Claire stared at the image for a long time. When she finally looked away, she noticed her reflection in the black of the screen. Her face was calm, almost curious. This was not a marriage cracking. This was a system leaking. She scrolled further. Daniel's report outlined transaction timing that felt familiar to anyone who understood structures. Small withdrawals first, no resistance, then larger sums, each move testing how much weight the structure could bear before anyone noticed. Grant hadn't started with theft. He'd started with confidence. Claire closed the file and shut down the laptop. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She slept. From that night on, Claire Harrington lived two lives. By day, she was the woman Darian expected. She attended school meetings, hosted dinners, smiled at neighbors. She listened as Grant talked about markets and long-term positioning. She nodded at the right moments. She kissed him goodbye when he traveled. She became invisible by design. By night, she documented. She bought a new laptop at a store across town and paid cash. She opened a checking account at a bank Grant had never used. She began logging every inconsistency, every transfer, every discrepancy. She learned which numbers repeated and which changed. She learned that Grant's gift was not greed, but arrogance. The children noticed nothing. Sophie remained absorbed in books and whispered secrets. Noah built elaborate Lego cities that collapsed and rose again without consequence. Baxter aged quietly, his muzzle growing lighter, his loyalty unchanged. Grant noticed nothing either. If anything, he seemed lighter, more confident. The man who came home late with excuses and apologies slowly transformed into someone who assumed forgiveness before it was granted. He spoke casually of future trips. He mentioned Dubai once, jokingly, as a place where smart people went when taxes got silly. Claire filed the comment away. 3 months into her private audit, Daniel Price sent one final message. Subject line, pattern confirmed. The body was short. This isn't an affair with financial overlap. The relationship appears functional. The companies appear deliberate. My assessment, she's not a side effect. She's part of the mechanism. Attached was an email chain between Grant and Tessa Wynn discussing liquidation timelines and exit positioning. The language was clean, professional, clinical. Claire read it twice, then she forwarded it to Marianne Holt. Marianne responded 10 minutes later. Now we know what kind of fire this is. That night, Claire stood in her office, lights off, looking out at her own house reflected faintly in the glass. She thought of her father's trust, of her children, of the ease with which Grant had assumed she would never look too closely. She didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, she began rehearsing a role she would play better than anyone expected, the perfect wife. And somewhere far away, Grant Harrington booked a holiday trip to the mountains, confident that the numbers were finally working in his favor, unaware that the structure beneath him had already been mapped, measured, and quietly condemned. Vail, Colorado, on Christmas Eve, did not feel like the real world. It felt curated. Snow lay thick and obedient on the rooftops, untouched except where ski tracks cut perfect lines down the mountain like signatures of wealth. The air smelled of pine, expensive wool, and money that had never worried about where the next dollar would come from. This was the kind of place people came to feel rewarded for their success. Grant Harrington stepped onto the balcony of his suite just after dawn, wrapped in a plush white robe embroidered with the resort's crest. The cold bit pleasantly at his skin. Below him, the village stirred awake snowplows humming softly, lifts beginning their slow ascent, the promise of leisure unfolding on schedule. He breathed deeply and smiled. This was freedom. Grant was a man who believed the world responded to confidence. At 51, his posture still carried the straight-backed certainty of someone who had always landed on his feet. The sharp lines of his face were relaxed here, away from boardrooms and family obligations. In this place, he felt untouchable. Behind him, Tessa Wynne emerged from the bedroom. She was 29, tall and slender, her movements economical and deliberate, as if even leisure were something to be optimized. Her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders this morning, glossy against pale skin that had never known real winter work. She wore an oversized cashmere sweater and bare feet, the picture of curated intimacy. Tessa did nothing accidentally. Every detail of her life, from her career in brand strategy to the way she angled her smile, had been designed to communicate momentum. "Still can't believe you pulled this off," she said, stepping beside him and handing him a mug of coffee. Her voice carried excitement, but underneath it was something sharper: anticipation. Grant chuckled. "Pulled what off?" "Christmas," she said. "Escaping, starting fresh." He took the mug, kissed her temple. "London bought us cover. Nobody questions London." "And Claire?" Tessa asked, watching his face closely. Grant waved a dismissive hand. "She's at home, probably baking something elaborate. She likes traditions." The lie felt easy. It had been rehearsed long before the flight was booked. They had arrived the night before, greeted by champagne and a roaring fire. A private sleigh ride dinner was scheduled for Christmas evening. Photos had already been taken, boots in fresh snow, champagne flutes against a mountain backdrop. Tessa had posted one story, then archived it immediately. She understood discretion when it mattered. Grant believed this trip marked a turning point. He had moved nearly $3 million into accounts Claire had never seen. Another transfer was queued for after the holidays. Dubai in February. A new firm. A new life. He told himself he would be generous in the divorce. Leave Claire the house. Give her enough money to stay comfortable. He saw this as mercy. Inside the suite, his phone chimed. Grant frowned, mildly annoyed. He had silenced most notifications. He checked the screen anyway. Subject line, notice of service. His stomach tightened, just slightly. Probably spam. Legal newsletters were always dramatic. Then another notification appeared, from the CEO of his firm. Subject, immediate suspension. Grant's hand went cold around the mug. He opened the email. Grant, effective immediately, your access to firm systems has been revoked. An external audit has been initiated following court-ordered disclosures. You are placed on unpaid administrative leave pending investigation. Do not contact clients. Do not remove records. The words blurred. Grant read them again, slower this time. "What is it?" Tessa asked, stepping closer. Grant didn't answer. His heart began to pound, loud enough that he could hear it over the crackle of the fire. He opened the first email. A PDF loaded slowly, then filled the screen with dense legal text. He scrolled, breath shallow. Divorce petition. Emergency motion. Allegations of asset dissipation. Intent to flee jurisdiction. Names jumped out at him like accusations. Cedar Ridge Strategies, LLC, Summit Vale Holdings, Northline Advisory. Tessa snatched the phone from his hand, her face drained of color as she read. "My name is on this," she whispered. "Grant, my name is on this." A sharp knock cut through the room. Grant froze. Another knock followed, firmer. "Mr. Harrington," a voice called from the other side of the door. "You have been served." The world tilted. Tessa backed away as if the words themselves might touch her. "This can't be happening. You said she didn't know." Grant swallowed hard. His mind raced, grasping for explanations, for exits. She must have guessed, or hired someone. It doesn't matter. We can handle this. Another knock, louder now. "Mr. Harrington, by order of the court—" "Open it," Tessa hissed. "You have to open it." Grant moved like a man underwater. He opened the door. The process server was unremarkable. A middle-aged man in a navy jacket, calm, professional. He confirmed Grant's identity, handed over the documents, and stepped back. "Merry Christmas," he said neutrally, then turned and walked away. Grant closed the door and slid down onto the edge of the sofa. The robe felt suddenly ridiculous. The room so perfect moments earlier felt hostile. Tessa stood rigid, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You told me this was clean," she said, her voice rising. "You told me this was legal." "It is," Grant snapped, more sharply than he intended. "Mostly. She's exaggerating." "Exaggerating?" Tessa laughed, brittle. "My name is on shell companies you created. They're calling it embezzlement." Grant's jaw tightened. "Lower your voice." "This was your plan," she said. "You said she was naive, that she trusted you." "She did," he shot back. "She just waited." The implication hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Grant's phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. "Do not attempt to leave the resort. State authorities have been notified." Tessa read it over his shoulder. Her eyes widened. "They're coming here." Grant stared at the phone, the truth settling like ice in his veins. Claire had let him go. She had let him pack, let him board the plane, let him believe he had won. She had waited until he was at altitude, until he was out of state, until jurisdiction wrapped around him like a net. This wasn't reaction. This was choreography. Tessa sank into a chair, her composure cracking. "What do we do?" Grant said nothing. His mind replayed the last 6 months, the moments he'd dismissed, the questions he'd answered too smoothly. He had underestimated her. He had mistaken silence for ignorance. Outside, church bells rang faintly in the village below. Christmas morning. Grant Harrington, who had built his life on leverage and appearances, realized too late that he had walked willingly onto the mountain, carrying every piece of evidence against himself. And somewhere far away, Claire Harrington was watching the clock, waiting for the next move to fall into place. Christmas morning in Connecticut arrived quietly, as if the state itself were holding its breath. The snow that had fallen overnight lay smoothed and orderly along the streets of Darien, trimmed by plows before most people woke. At 8:45 a.m., the Harrington house looked unchanged. Lights still warm, wreath still centered on the front door. Baxter's paw prints faint along the back patio. Only the clocks inside mattered now. At 9:01 a.m. exactly, Claire Harrington sat at her desk with a headset on, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her laptop. She wore a charcoal sweater and tailored trousers, her hair pulled into the same low knot she favored on job sites. Functional, disciplined, impossible to misread. On the screen were 3 faces. A senior banker from a private institution Grant had never used, Marianne Holt in her steel gray suit, and a compliance officer whose expression was careful and practiced. "Mrs. Harrington," the banker said, "upon your authorization and pursuant to the emergency order, we are prepared to move the liquid assets from the joint accounts and the children's trusts into protected escrow." "Proceed," Claire said. Her voice was even. No tremor, no flourish. Keys clicked, numbers shifted. A lifetime of access vanished in seconds. "And the family trust?" Marianne asked. "The injunction has been granted," the banker replied. "Mr. Harrington's signing authority is suspended effective immediately." Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in relief, not in triumph, but in confirmation. The first cut had been clean. At 9:47 a.m., the call ended. Claire removed the headset, stood, and walked through the house. She passed the living room where stockings still hung by the fireplace. She did not touch them. She stopped in the kitchen long enough to refill Baxter's water bowl. The dog watched her with calm, intelligent eyes, tail thumping once as if acknowledging a change he could not name. At exactly 10 a.m., a white van rolled quietly into the driveway. 2 men stepped out. They wore windbreakers, jeans, and the unremarkable look of people who preferred not to be remembered. One was tall and narrow-shouldered with a shaved head and a jaw that suggested former military discipline. The other was shorter, stockier, his beard trimmed close, eyes alert but courteous. "Mrs. Harrington?" the taller one asked. "Yes." "We're here for the systems." They moved efficiently. Garage code reset, front door access revoked, smart locks reassigned. Grant's phone, once the master key to the house he thought he owned, was erased from the network. The house did not resist. It accepted new authority without complaint. At 10:23 a.m., the men left. The van disappeared down the road. Claire locked the door behind them, then went upstairs. Sophie and Noah were awake, already tearing into wrapping paper with the focused joy of children whose universe had not yet cracked. Sophie, tall for her age, with dark hair that mirrored her mother's, barely looked up. Noah grinned wildly. Lego pieces scattered like confetti across the floor. "Mom, look!" Noah shouted. "Santa brought the big set." "He did," Claire said, smiling. A real smile this time. "How would you two feel about another surprise?" Sophie narrowed her eyes, suspicious. "What kind?" "A sleepover," Claire said. "At Aunt Janet's." The reaction was immediate. Joyful chaos. Janet Harrington lived in Westport, 3 towns away, in a house that smelled perpetually of coffee and cinnamon and had fewer rules than most small democracies. Sophie adored her. Noah worshipped her. At 11:30 a.m., Claire loaded the car. Janet Harrington stood waiting when they arrived. Janet was 52, broad-shouldered and athletic, with sun-streaked auburn hair cut just below her chin and skin that spoke of long mornings running along the shore. She dressed casually, jeans, boots, a thick sweater, but carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had survived a messy divorce years earlier and never apologized for it. Janet had learned, the hard way, how quickly security could evaporate. She took one look at Claire and pulled her into a fierce embrace. "It started," Janet said quietly. "Yes." "Good." The children barreled past them, Baxter close behind, his tail a golden blur. Janet watched them disappear down the hall, then turned back to her sister. "Kitchen?" she said. "You look like you haven't eaten." Claire followed her inside, the warmth of the house settling around her like a temporary shield. Janet poured coffee without asking, slid a mug across the counter. "You don't have to explain everything," Janet said. "Just tell me what you need." Claire wrapped her hands around the mug. "I need the house emptied by the end of the day." Janet's eyebrows lifted. "Already?" "Yes." Janet nodded once. No questions, no commentary. At 12:18 p.m., Claire's phone rang. She answered without looking at the screen. "I'm driving." "I know," a woman said briskly. "I'll make this quick." Cara Bell stood beside a sleek black SUV parked at the edge of Claire's driveway when Claire returned an hour later. Cara Bell was in her early 40s, tall and striking, her blonde hair pulled into a sharp ponytail that matched the precision of her expression. She wore a tailored camel coat, heels that did not sink into snow, and the unmistakable air of someone who closed deals before lunch. In Fairfield County, Cara Bell did not chase listings. Listings chased her. "The timing is aggressive," Cara said, shaking Claire's hand. "I respect that." "I want it listed," Claire said. "Staged. Fast." Cara's eyes flicked briefly to the house. "This isn't emotional?" "No." "Good," Cara said, "because that never sells." They walked the property together. Cara moved quickly, already cataloging angles, light, narrative. Claire provided specs without embellishment, square footage, materials, structural highlights. She did not mention memories. "What about your husband?" Cara asked carefully. "He doesn't live here anymore." Cara nodded. She had learned when to stop. At 1:42 p.m., Claire signed the listing agreement. At 2 p.m., a "Coming Soon" sign was driven into the frozen lawn. The sound of the hammer echoed down the street, sharp and unmistakable. Neighbors slowed their cars. Curtains shifted. Phones came out. By 3:15 p.m., a staging crew moved through the house with surgical efficiency, removing family photos, neutralizing color, transforming lived-in space into aspirational product. Claire watched from the doorway as her life was stripped to clean lines and empty surfaces. She felt no regret. She felt precision. At 4:07 p.m., her burner phone vibrated. A Colorado number. She let it ring. Again and again. On the fourth call, she answered and pressed record. "Claire!" Grant's voice burst through, raw and panicked, stripped of every polished edge she had ever known. "What the hell is happening? My accounts are frozen. There are people here. I can't—" "My name is Claire," she said calmly. "And yes, I know." A long, broken silence followed. "You did this," he whispered. "Yes. You're destroying everything." "No," Claire said, watching the coming soon sign sway slightly in the cold. "I'm finishing it." She ended the call. As dusk settled over Darien, the Harrington house stood staged and silent, a perfect shell. The sign on the lawn gleamed under the streetlight, impossible to miss. The town had begun to notice. And far away in the mountains, a man who had built his life on access and assumption realized he had no way back in. 2 weeks later, the courthouse in Stamford stood under a hard winter sky, its stone facade scrubbed clean by cold and light. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and old arguments. The first hearing of Harrington versus Harrington was scheduled for 9:30 a.m., and by 9:12, Grant Harrington was already sweating. He sat at the defense table in a suit that did not belong to him the way his old ones had. The fabric was stiff, the shoulders slightly off, the color a tired charcoal that looked rented even if it wasn't. His hair had been cut too recently, too sharply, as if discipline could be purchased at the last minute. The confidence that once radiated from his posture had collapsed inward. His jaw was clenched, his hands restless. He glanced at the door every few seconds, searching for leverage where none remained. Beside him sat his attorney, Michael Rusk. Rusk was in his mid-30s, thin, pale, with a receding hairline he tried to disguise by combing what remained forward. His suit was cheap but pressed, his tie knotted too tightly. He had the eager, brittle energy of someone who had never handled a case this large and had accepted it anyway. Rusk nodded often, whispered quickly, and avoided eye contact with anyone who looked confident. Grant leaned in. "You're sure about this approach?" Rusk swallowed. "We challenge intent. Paint her as unstable, alienation, emotional manipulation." Grant nodded. It sounded like a plan. It sounded like noise. Across the aisle, Claire Harrington sat with Marianne Holt. Claire wore a navy suit with clean lines and flat black shoes. Her hair was pulled back, her face composed, unreadable. She looked exactly as she did on job sites when contractors tried to cut corners, present, alert, unmovable. She did not look at Grant. Marianne Holt, by contrast, looked directly at him. Marianne stood when the judge entered, tall and narrow, her silver hair catching the overhead light like a blade. Her eyes were sharp, amused in a way that never reached warmth. She had dismantled men like Grant Harrington before, and she knew when the structure was already compromised. Judge Eleanor Fitch presided that morning. Judge Fitch was in her early 60s, dark-skinned, with closely cropped hair and a voice that carried without effort. She had spent decades on the bench and had little patience for theatrics. Her gaze moved from one table to the other, assessing not just arguments, but posture, discipline, truth. "Mr. Rusk," she said, "you may begin." Grant rose before his attorney could stop him. "This is a vendetta," he blurted. "My wife is unstable. She's poisoning my children against me. She locked me out of my own house. She—" "Sit down, Mr. Harrington," Judge Fitch said calmly. Grant hesitated, then obeyed. Rusk cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client asserts that Mrs. Harrington's actions constitute retaliatory abuse. She has acted out of spite, not reason freezing accounts, removing access to the marital home, initiating a fire sale of assets." Marianne stood. "Permission to respond?" "Briefly," Judge Fitch said. Marianne did not raise her voice. She never needed to. "Your Honor, We have prepared exhibits demonstrating a documented pattern of financial misconduct, including unauthorized transfers from protected trusts, the creation of shell entities, and written communications outlining plans to liquidate marital assets and relocate to the UAE. She nodded once. A clerk distributed folders. Grant watched the papers move down the bench like falling dominoes. Email chains, wire transfers, LLC registrations, messages discussing exit timelines and offshore buffers. Judge Fitch skimmed, then read more slowly. Mr. Rusk tried to speak. Judge Fitch raised a hand. "Counsel," she said, eyes still on the page, "your client appears to have planned his departure before these proceedings ever began." Grant felt something inside him give way. "That's not—" he began. Mary Ann spoke again, her tone almost conversational. "There is one more clarification, Your Honor, regarding the marital residence." Judge Fitch looked up. "Go on." "The property was never jointly owned." Grant's head snapped up. Mary Ann continued. "The house in Darien was purchased 13 years ago by Harrington Architectural Group, LLC, a company solely owned by Mrs. Harrington. The purchase was funded entirely by premarital assets. Mr. Harrington was granted occupancy rights, not ownership." The courtroom went very still. Grant laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "That's impossible." Mary Ann slid a document across. Deed records, title history, mortgage filings. Judge Fitch reviewed them carefully. "So," she said at last, "Mr. Harrington, you were living in a structure built, owned, and financed by your wife's firm." Grant's mouth opened, closed, opened again. I contributed," he stammered. "Maintenance, taxes." "You paid rent," Mary Ann said gently. "Irregularly." Judge Fitch removed her glasses. "Mr. Harrington, you will refrain from further interruption." Grant slumped back into his chair. The fortress he had believed himself to be losing had never been his. During recess, Claire's phone buzzed. Cara Bell's name flashed on the screen. Claire stepped into the hallway. "Tell me." "It's done," Cara said, her voice tight with satisfaction. "Harbor Line Holdings, all cash, $9.3 million, clean close." Claire exhaled slowly. Grant, passing nearby, overheard the tail end. His eyes lit with manic hope. "You sold it," he said loudly. "You sold the house. You've lost your mind." Claire turned to him for the first time that day. "Yes," she said, "I sold it." Grant laughed, relief bleeding through hysteria. "Then it's marital proceeds. Then You misunderstand," Claire said quietly. "Harbor Line is mine." Grant froze. Harbor Line Holdings, LLC had been incorporated 10 days earlier, funded entirely by Claire's separate accounts, structured to acquire the property free and clear. The sale extinguished the fraudulent lien Grant had secretly placed against the house using forged authorization. The purchase reestablished ownership without encumbrance. Claire had not abandoned the house. She had purified it. Back in the courtroom, Judge Fitch reconvened. "I am granting the temporary restraining order," she ruled. "Asset freeze remains in effect. Custody remains with Mrs. Harrington pending further review. Mr. Harrington is prohibited from contacting Mrs. Harrington except through counsel." Grant stood, trembling. "This isn't justice." Judge Fitch looked at him steadily. "No, Mr. Harrington. This is accounting." The gavel struck. That evening, Claire returned home. The house looked the same from the outside, but the air inside felt different, lighter, honest. The locks recognized her. The walls held no debt. The space belonged, finally, to its architect. Sophie ran to her first, then Noah, then Baxter, who pressed his graying muzzle into her leg and side. Claire knelt, gathered them close. Outside, the "coming soon" sign had been removed. There was no need for it anymore. She stood in the living room as the fire crackled back to life, not as someone reclaiming a memory, but as someone occupying ground she had always owned. Justice had not shouted. It had not begged for applause. It had simply been built correctly.